Victoria's hotel quarantine scandal, confirmed by genomic testing, is responsible for 99% of Victoria's second wave. The job losses, the economic destruction, of course, and a death toll now exceeding 700 Victorians. Day after day, Victoria's government and emergency officials have fronted the inquiry into the bungle. And day after day, we're finding out just how chaotic the decision, handling of the mess, the decision-making, the behind-the-scenes movements all were. This week, the inquiry has uncovered some startling revelation. Daniel Andrews was, in fact, offered ADF assistance. We know that now, and confirmed in writing. Emergency management protocols were in place and ready to be used in a pandemic. We saw the book, didn't we? The manual at the start of the show, but they went ignored. And yesterday, the revelation by former Victoria Police Chief Commissioner Graham Ashton, it was the Premier's own political office who gave the go-ahead via text for private security officers to be employed. Let's bring in an expert on security here. The CEO of Calamity Security, Mr. Daniel Lewkovitz, joins me now from Sydney, along with Victoria's Shadow Minister for Police, Liberal MP, Mr. David Southwick. David, I'll start with you if I can. Really serious, significant revelations this week. Probably, to me, the most astounding were the text messages between the now former police chief, Mr. Ashton, and his interstate AFP colleagues, confirming it was the Premier's private office that did, in fact, give the go-ahead for these security officials to be used, or these private individuals. Now, I've worked in one of those roles in a leader's office, obviously in Canberra, but I find it extraordinary that sort of decision wasn't taken by the Premier, in consultation, cabinet, whatever. In this case, it looks like it was made by staff. That surprises me enormously.
Yeah, Peter, look, there is no way that decision was made without the Premier knowing. And what we're seeing time and time again is the Premier abdicating any responsibility for any of this, including the ADF response, as you quite rightly pointed out. The other point with this is that the minister responsible for both police and emergency service, which is effectively the security guards and the policing and the ADF, she was absolutely involved in all of this. And we now know that it was the Premier's own office that ordered private security ahead of the ADF and police, which has caused a second wave, as you quite rightly pointed out, has caused countless deaths and job loss that we will probably never, ever recover from. It's absolutely a horrific situation. But we've been saying time and time again, the Premier has to come clean. He's got to take responsibility for this. This is a huge policy failure, one that I think we would never, ever have seen before, and hopefully we'll never see again.
Daniel, I'll go to you. You're an expert in security, and you will have seen all of this now as it's played out over the last few months. The offer of ADF support, which was refused, the lack of training, the lack even of a public tender for the use of private security. Where do you assess things in Victoria? Was this inevitable, that it would be such a train wreck, considering all of these decisions?
Well, what's happened in Victoria was certainly predictable, and the failures of the security industry were predictable. And the proof of that is the fact that the Victorian government had previously stipulated that there was going to be a review into the private security industry in Victoria. So they knew there were problems in security, and because of knowing that those problems and not doing anything to mitigate them meant that a lot of this was absolutely preventable. Now, private security in and of itself is not necessarily a problem. If we look at New South Wales, where I am, private security has done over 1 million man-hours of work and looked after 60,000 detainees in quarantine with none of the problems that have happened in Victoria. And the reason is because the New South Wales security industry is better regulated, unlike the regulation under the Victoria Police. Secondly, they had an audit program here that's done thousands and thousands of audits, checking guards, making sure they're wearing their PPE, making sure they're licensed, making sure they know what their instructions is. Whereas what happened in Victoria is you had bureaucrats who had no understanding of the security industry whatsoever, who just rang a company they'd never heard of and said, "Can you do it?" The company's gone, "Yep, we think we can do it." And they've gone, "Great, off you go." And the rest we know. We saw exactly what happened. And unfortunately, the analogy would be like if you wanted to, say, repaint the Sydney Harbour Bridge and reassign that contract. So you rang the guy that paints your house and said, can you do it? And he said, well, I'd have to bring in 30 other companies that you've never heard of. And they went, OK, do it. That would never happen. But what happened with this security contract is they were then able to bring in subcontractors that no one had ever heard of. And the people actually running the program, the bureaucrats who found themselves in charge of this, never even thought to question that, never thought to monitor it or regulate it. And the rest we know.
So, David, that's a very, very good analysis there from Daniel, the differences between New South Wales and Victoria. Martin Pakula, who made the decision, he was the minister at the time, to go down the path of outsourcing this without a tender. We know that the private security industry in Victoria is regulated or run under the same unions that he is a member of. So there's a connection there. But none of the belts and braces that are in New South Wales are in Victoria. That's a concern. And we're talking about millions of dollars here.
Yeah, Peter. Well, the issue in Victoria is Daniel Andrews has tried to rewrite the book on doing everything when it comes to a COVID response. We've seen it with contact tracing. We've seen it with, as you say, and Daniel quite rightly pointed out, in every other state we certainly had security guards being used, but the management, the control of that was done with police and the ADF. You can't just hire security guards who then subcontract out and say, here you go, without any training at all. The only training that we've since found out that some of these individuals had was looking at being able to look at dealing with more gender and inclusive training rather than actually security training. I mean, it's an absolute disgrace that we had this kind of thing happening. And ultimately, there was no leadership and there was no one managing the situation. In fact, the police would actually ensure that people were picked up from the airport, dropped off at the hotel, and the rest of it was left up to security guards to do as they please. We've also seen that emails were sent from police themselves that saw the shenanigans that were going on and requiring that something needed to be done. And the response was that something should be done before it became a media issue. A media issue, not a life and death issue, but a media issue. The whole thing is a complete and utter disgrace. And as we've called on a motion of no confidence in the Premier, Daniel Andrews, the buck stops with him and he needs to go.
Daniel,
Peter,
Daniel, I want to ask you with your expertise here. Go back to New South Wales. We know the ADF and the police worked in concert, as you just said there, with all of the private security deployed at the hotels. It's worked seamlessly. In Victoria, we've found now very clearly in writing with emails between various chiefs in different states, they've refused ADF support on a number of occasions. Did that surprise you? Because they've worked together interstate, but they were refused in Victoria.
Well, one of the clearest things to come out of the Victorian Hotel Quarantine inquiry is how unclear the leadership actually was. We're yet to get to the bottom of who was actually running the show. Now, I don't believe you need the ADF or you need the police to do all of the heavy lifting. There's no reason private security can't do it. But ADF and police are very good at a chain of command, whereas thanks to the public servants organising the program in Victoria, no one actually knew who was in charge. And even now, this is not a case of people diving for cover. Right from the beginning, they didn't know who was running the show. And the thing is, the early warning bells were all there. I mean, one of the revelations that came out this week was that there were reports of security guards who were declining to use hand sanitizer because their religion may have presented a problem for the alcohol in that hand sanitizer. Now, they should have been gone from the program, or this should have been flagged very early, but of course it wasn't. So 10 out of 10 for diversity, but minus several million for security management of a public health emergency. And coming back to how these groups were hired, again, right at the beginning, the bureaucrats in charge as well. I mean, I understand they might not have had time to throw together a tender. That does take time. But the first thing they did, for reasons I don't understand, is march down to Trades Hall and seek the blessing of the unions in which companies they had. Now, last I checked, the unions aren't actually in charge, but apparently in Victoria it works differently. And the biggest shame of all is that those people responsible will still have a job paying several $100,000 a year when all this is over and a lot of other Victorians have lost their jobs and homes.
Got to leave it there. I'm sorry, I could talk about this all night. David Southwick, Daniel Lewkovitz, thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Peter.
Have a good night.